Welcome everyone, this is On Just Restart, and this time we're going to be talking about when we could be seeing the sequel to Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild. A lot of people are greatly anticipating this game, myself included. There's a wide belief that Breath of the Wild 2 will be coming out sometime in 2021. But is this actually the case? Is this likely? And if so, at what point will we see this game come out? Will it be early 2021? Will it be mid 2021? Will it be a late holiday title? That's what we're going to be talking about today. Now before we jump into things, let me quickly talk about my social media. There's a Twitter page, a Discord community, a Patron page, and a Twitch channel. If you are interested in any of that, check it all out, it's linked in the description below, and of course, if you like what you're seeing here, subscribe. Before we can determine when Breath of the Wild 2 will be coming out, I think we should first decide how far into development Breath of the Wild 2 even is. Back in late 2017, in Breath of the Wild Masterworks, we got news from Eiji Aonuma that the next Legend of Zelda was already in development. Back in 2017, we saw the release for Breath of the Wild. It came out in March, and the DLC for it came out throughout the year. Then at the end of the year, the final piece of the DLC, the Champion's Ballad, came out along with Masterworks, and there we got the news that the next Zelda was already in development. But at the time, we didn't know much else beyond that, just that they were working on the next Zelda. But then fast forward to E3 2019. At the end of the presentation, even though Nintendo did not need to reveal anything else, a lot of us had already lost our voices screaming in excitement from the Banjo-Kazooie reveal. They were like, you know what, here's just one more thing. And that one more thing was a story trailer slash teaser for the sequel to Breath of the Wild, the game we've been calling Breath of the Wild 2 ever since. Once we got this trailer, a lot of people, myself included, felt that this game was very, very far into development, for a few different reasons. One of which being, well, because it was confirmed to us back in 2017 that they had already started development, but also because this trailer showed us that this is a sequel that's going to be using Breath of the Wild as a foundation. When you have a foundation in place, when you have an engine in place already, even though they may make modifications to that engine and such, because there is a foundation, a lot of the legwork is already done. That can cut down development time by a year or two. So the fact that the next big Zelda is a sequel already shortens that development cycle significantly. But we also saw a story trailer that definitely seemed to be some form of an in-game graphical engine, but because it was a story trailer, that tells us that they're fairly far. They kind of know what they're doing here. They have a decent understanding of how the game is going to be shaping up. The Zelda team tends to focus on gameplay and mechanics first, and then they build a story around that. So the fact that we saw this trailer where Ganondorf is being resurrected, that tells us that they already have a good understanding of what mechanics and gameplay they're going to be using, and they're already starting to build a story around that. So because of all of that, a lot of people thought that Breath of the Wild 2 even had a chance to come out in 2020, myself included. Of course, that did not happen, and when we are talking about Zelda games in general, we should probably be prepared for delays, because historically, that's what's happened. Zelda games take a very long time to develop. The Legend of Zelda Skyward Sword came out at the end of 2011, and we didn't see Breath of the Wild, the next big 3D Zelda follow-up, come out until the early part of 2017. Basically, 5 years and a few months. Breath of the Wild, Twilight Princess, Skyward Sword, they all took a very, very long time to be made. So when we're talking about the next Zelda, like Breath of the Wild 2, we should definitely be cautious of expecting an early release date, absolutely. But I would argue that early release date, or release year, was 2020. It did not happen, there was a pandemic, we got Age of Calamity instead, and it seems that Nintendo may never have even had plans to release it at that point. But either way, I feel like it's pretty fair to say that the game is very, very far into development. They started work back in 2017. They were using Breath of the Wild as a base. Then, a year and a half later, we saw a story trailer for this game. And if they're already working on story to some extent already, that suggests that they already have a lot of the gameplay mechanics in place, at least based off how they've handled development for other Zelda games, like Skyward Sword, for example. So for all of these reasons, I feel like it's pretty safe to say that the development cycle for Breath of the Wild 2 will very likely be shorter than the development cycle for Breath of the Wild 1. What I'm getting at here is that I'm thinking that the development cycle for Breath of the Wild 2 will be about 4 years once everything is said and done, placing the game's release year sometime this year, 2021. Is it possible that the game could come out later on, perhaps in 2022, for example? Yes, of course. Games are always subject to delay. That is always a possibility. Development is fluid, things can come up, they may come up with other ideas, there may be hiccups, all sorts of things can happen. The pandemic occurred, that has caused delays with all sorts of development cycles for all different games from different companies in the gaming industry, for sure. But currently, my impression is that Nintendo definitely plans to release Breath of the Wild 2 at some point in 2021. There's been a lot of talk about a lot of great big things coming out in 2021. A lot of people are under the impression that Nintendo's going to have a really big year. And I am definitely inclined to agree. If you look at 2020, it was a bit of a down year for Nintendo in terms of software output. So I'm really just thinking that 2020 was kind of like the calm before the storm. 2021 is going to be a really big year. We've talked about in multiple videos already how a lot of the big development teams from Nintendo came out with games in 2017. If you fast forward to 2021, that gives them 4 years to make really big games. One of those development teams is the Zelda team. I think 4 years is about enough time to make a big brand new Zelda game that is using an already established engine, for sure. But on top of that, if we take a look at the Age of Calamity reveal video, it wasn't just a trailer, it was like a 6-minute video where AJ Numa came out and talked about a few different things. Then we got the trailer, and then we saw some talk from the Koei Tecmo development team. In that video, AJ Numa told us that we would have to wait a bit longer before we would get some more updates on Breath of the Wild 2. What is a bit longer? We didn't see it at the Game Awards, but how much longer would it have to be before it's no longer a bit longer, right? Obviously, that's a very vague term. It's translated. It's hard to say for sure what he really meant, and perhaps at the time he didn't even know what he really meant. However, there's one really important thing that's happening fairly soon, and that is The Legend of Zelda's 35th anniversary on February 21st, 2021. We are just about 6 or so weeks away. It's not that long from now, and I feel pretty confident in saying that Nintendo has some plans for this. Why am I saying that? Well, lately, in general, whenever there's some sort of big 5-year anniversary of some sort, Nintendo has some sort of announcement for that particular series. They did the Fire Emblem 30th anniversary back in December, and of course they did Mario's 35th anniversary early last year as well. They're still having games coming out and different celebrations for it, but the big release back in September of 2020 was Super Mario 3D All-Stars. And what's interesting about this is that we had signs pointing towards this months beforehand. There was a lot of trademarks for a whole bunch of games and merchandising that we saw for Mario, and what we've seen more recently is a similar style of trademarks but for Zelda, suggesting that Nintendo has similar plans as they've had for Mario. And it makes sense for Nintendo to celebrate Zelda's 35th anniversary. With the release of Breath of the Wild, the Zelda franchise has reached far greater heights. Breath of the Wild is by far the greatest selling Zelda game. It is actually outpacing Super Mario Odyssey, the mainline 3D Mario for the Nintendo Switch. And even smaller Zelda products like Link's Awakening and Age of Calamity are some of the best-selling Zelda franchise games as well. They are very high up there. And a lot of this can be attributed to the newfound fame on the Nintendo Switch for the Zelda series. Zelda is far greater now. So thanks to the Nintendo Switch, thanks to Breath of the Wild, both of which launched together, the Zelda franchise is at a whole other level, and Nintendo's definitely going to want to take advantage of that and celebrate the 35th anniversary. So because of that, we're in this situation right now where we didn't get any sort of Zelda announcement or anything at the Game Awards, where we usually have gotten some sort of Zelda announcement, and just a couple months beforehand, AJ Numa told us that we would just have to wait a little bit longer before we got updates on Breath of the Wild 2. Well, the next big opportunity is for Zelda's 35th anniversary. And I guarantee you this, if the next big 3D Mario wasn't too far off, they would have talked about it during Mario's 35th anniversary direct. In other words, because Breath of the Wild 2 isn't too far off, they will be talking about it during whatever Nintendo has planned for Zelda's 35th anniversary. Because we're getting 3D World right now, because there is no mention of another big 3D Mario during Mario's 35th anniversary direct, I'm not expecting for us to see, say for example, a Mario Odyssey 2 to come out sometime in 2021. And I feel like that's something that's worth noting, because if Nintendo did have a big new 3D Mario ready for this holiday, then maybe they would have that come out during the holidays and Zelda would come out at a different time. But because I don't think a big 3D Mario is coming out in this year besides 3D World Deluxe plus Bowser's Fury, maybe then Breath of the Wild 2 could come out for the holiday. Which sort of brings me to talking about the window of when we could see Breath of the Wild 2 come out. And that window, in my opinion, is somewhere between March and November. That is quite a large window, I know, but I feel like it's going to fall somewhere in that period. And there's a few reasons why. One of those reasons is because of Hyrule Warriors Age of Calamity. That came out at the end of 2020. So if they had that come out then, I feel like it would be weird for Breath of the Wild 2 to be revealed really soon and come out, say for example, this March. Is it out of the question? No, it's not out of the question, but Breath of the Wild 2 is probably going to be Nintendo's biggest game for 2021, or at least its most expensive to make. So they're going to want to give as much advertising and time to push this game as possible. This is not a 3D All-Star situation where it's just a compilation of 3 old Mario games that are getting a minimal remaster made by a very small team elsewhere. This is the main Zelda team, and this is definitely one of the biggest games Nintendo has ever made. So it's going to need time to be marketed and pushed, and they're not going to be bringing it out just a couple months after another major Zelda release. Not to mention, they skipped the Game Awards, so if Breath of the Wild was coming out this March, they probably would have shown it off there. That would have been the ultimate opportunity to announce it then. Which brings us back to the Zelda Anniversary coming this February. I definitely expect Nintendo to talk about Breath of the Wild 2 by the time of this anniversary, so we're not too far from that time. But it's definitely not coming out then. I feel like that's really, really unlikely. And because I believe Nintendo's gonna be doing more than just Breath of the Wild 2 for Zelda's 35th anniversary, I also don't think it's likely to think that Breath of the Wild 2 will be coming out in March. And also because I think Nintendo's planning other Zelda things beyond just Breath of the Wild 2, I think we're gonna be seeing other Zelda things announced around the February time, and those things could be coming out a little bit before Breath of the Wild 2. For example, maybe we get Skyward Sword HD around March, potentially, or at least sometime before summer. I think if we're getting some sort of Zelda remaster, be it Skyward Sword or some sort of other type of Zelda collection, I feel like that's something that would have to come out a few months before Breath of the Wild 2. So say we get this Zelda Legacy content, whatever it may be, in the first half of 2021, at that point, Breath of the Wild 2 would make more sense for the second half of 2021. So we're already starting to whittle down that release period. Of course, there's all the speculation right now of a big Switch Pro. Even more analysts have come out predicting that a Switch Pro or something like that is coming out this year. And if that's the case, maybe Nintendo will want to come out with Breath of the Wild 2 to support this system. That is definitely a possibility, but it's also possible Nintendo may want to come out with a Switch Pro earlier in the year. Hard to say for sure. But if I had to guess, I would say a Switch Pro is going to come out sometime between March and September. Why? Well, March is the end of the fiscal year, and Nintendo may want to get an additional push out there to put that out. On top of that, historically, we've seen Nintendo release revisions alongside big third-party games and some sort of Zelda remaster. In 2015, we saw the release of the new 3DS alongside Majora's Mask 3D and Monster Hunter 4 Ultimate. In 2019, we saw the release of Link's Awakening Remake alongside the Switch Lite and also Dragon Quest XI's. Nintendo actually published that game for the Switch so they could have the best port possible of Dragon Quest on the Switch. Point is, we've seen somewhat of a pattern here, and it wouldn't shock me if around March, for the release of Monster Hunter Rise, we see the release of a Switch revision, and maybe also some sort of Zelda remaster content, perhaps a Zelda collection or Skyward Sword HD. Of course, because of the pandemic and all, we may have to wait a little bit longer, so that could be pushed up until around this summertime potentially. But say Nintendo doesn't want to do that, maybe they really want to launch it alongside Breath of the Wild 2. If that's the case, then maybe I could see Breath of the Wild 2 coming out earlier than the holiday season, maybe around September, similar to when the Switch Lite came out back in 2019, in September. That is a decent time to release a console revision. I'm not expecting Nintendo to save the Switch Pro until the holidays. I think they're going to want to release it a few months beforehand. Save for brand new generation systems, when it comes to hardware, Nintendo doesn't like to release their hardware during the holiday season. They tend to release it a little bit beforehand. So the latest I see a Switch revision coming out is around this September, and if that's the case, I could see Breath of the Wild 2 potentially being ready then. But honestly, by that point, it wouldn't shock me if Nintendo saves Breath of the Wild 2 to be the big holiday release. And I'm actually expecting Nintendo to have more than just Breath of the Wild 2 ready. I'm thinking we're going to get both a new Pokemon game and Breath of the Wild 2. So maybe we get this new Pokemon game in either October or November, and whichever month that Pokemon game falls in, we get Breath of the Wild 2 and the other month. That's what I'm sort of thinking right now. I don't think Nintendo's going to save something like a Metroid Prime trilogy or a Bayonetta 3 to be the big holiday release alongside Pokemon. I really feel like Breath of the Wild 2 makes the most sense. Is it possible Nintendo could have some other sort of surprise announcement to come out towards the end of the year instead of Breath of the Wild 2? For sure. Nintendo has a lot of different development teams. Like I said, there are multiple development teams that came out with games back in 2017. There could be something else ready that could come out around then. Of course, that game could also come out earlier in the year, and Breath of the Wild 2 could be saved for the holidays. Typically, when it comes to big brand new Zelda games, they come out during the holiday period. Breath of the Wild was an exception. That game was held back for the Nintendo Switch when it came out March 2017. Because it doesn't look like Breath of the Wild 2 is coming out for the early part of the year like the original Breath of the Wild, I'm thinking this game really just makes the most sense to come out for holiday 2021. But we shall see. What do you guys think is happening with the release of Breath of the Wild 2? Do you think it's coming out in 2021? And if so, at what point? Let me know in the comments below. Anyways everyone, this is On Just Restart. Thank you so much for listening and watching, and I'll see you all really soon. Take care.